All right, and welcome back. Today we are going to take a look at the three variables that impact exposure. And we are going to start off with ISO sensitivity, which is kind of like the red-headed stepchild of the exposure triangle. People often think about adjusting their shutter speed and their aperture, but rarely ever give much thought to the ISO. And we're going to take a look at why that is. So it makes sense to start out with just what exactly is ISO. ISO is an objective standard for the sensitivity of a camera's sensor to light. Technically speaking, ISO is an acronym for the International Standards Organization. Literally no one will ever ask you that. But what's important to know is that it is a measurement, it's a standardized way to measure the sensitivity of a sensor. If you ever had the experience of shooting film back in the day, you would typically purchase a roll of film and you would purchase it based on its film speed. Generally speaking, a 200 ISO or ASA film speed rating was good for general purpose, and you would buy a faster film, say an 800 or a 1600 speed film, if you were planning on doing something that would need that. In the days of film, the plastic or the acetate sheet that was the roll of film was coated with an emulsion of silver nitrate. And chemists found that larger grains of silver would produce more sensitive films. So in order to make a faster film, they would use film that had been coated with larger grains of silver nitrate. The drawback, however, was that the silver grains, when they were larger like that, were more visible in the final image. And so you would end up with a grittier, grainier image. The same can be true in digital cameras, where we can make a camera sensor more sensitive or less sensitive using some of the menus in the internal of the camera. Choosing a more sensitive sensor will result in an image that is a bit more grainy and a bit more pixelated. All right, so here we have the range of ISO speeds that are commonly available in many digital cameras. Typically, the 50 ISO speeds will really be available in the higher end cameras. Most entry-level cameras will start out at 100, and they'll go all the way up to 6400. Most digital cameras will now go much, much higher, up to even 128,000 ISO. What you need to realize is that the lower that number, the less sensitive that it will be to light. The higher the number, the more sensitive it will be. What that ultimately means is that if it's less sensitive, it will capture less light at a low speed. It'll capture more light at a high speed. And the bottom line here is that the lower speeds will include less noise and less grain, gives you a smoother image, and images that are shot at a higher ISO are going to have more grain and more noise. Now, in today's digital cameras, you can actually adjust the ISO for each and every individual image if you'd want. In the film days, you would load an entire roll of film and you were shooting 24 or 36 exposures at that particular film speed. I would say that in general, your best rule of thumb is for ISO, you're going to want to set it as low as you possibly can and raise it only when you have a particular reason to need to change it. For example, if you're shooting in low light or shooting fast action, you might want to raise your ISO to be able to record an image in that particular environment. But otherwise, we want to leave it generally as low as we possibly can. This variable is the one that photographers will generally set it and forget it. Set your ISO for the entire shoot, and then image by image, you'll be adjusting your shutter speed and aperture, but leaving ISO scale pretty well left alone. Here we have an example of what ISO film speed will look like in your final images. Choosing an ISO that is fairly low, like a 100 or 200, will give you nice smooth transitions even within the pixels here. When we jack that up to 3200 or 6400 or even higher, you'll notice that there's a little bit more grain or texture or grit here in the details. You'll notice it in the shadows, you'll notice it in the highlights. This generally is considered to be a less effective image a less desirable image when you have this visible grain pattern. So that is probably one of the biggest reasons that we generally want to keep your ISO as low as possible and raise it only when necessary. Now here's an example of a low ISO speed. I believe I shot this at about ISO 100 up in Racket Lake in the Adirondacks. If you notice, there is, subtle, smooth transitions. You don't see the grittiness, the texture. To be perfectly honest, in small scale images, when you're looking at things on Facebook or Instagram, you may not even be zoomed in enough to see the grain pattern that is inherent with a higher ISO. But if you're going to be making prints, particularly large prints, low ISO will definitely be of value. Low ISO speeds will give smoother images, but they are going to give you longer shutter speeds because they need more time to let light in, or you'll end up using a wider aperture and giving yourself a shallower depth of field, possibly both. You could end up looking at longer shutter speeds and a wider aperture by using low ISO speeds. So sometimes you may choose to raise your ISO to be able to overcome one of those variables. In this image, although it may be hard to see on your screen, but up here is a model rocket. This comes from the 4-H camp. This is just an example of a high ISO. Granted, we were shooting at midday, so there's plenty of sunlight, but my goal was to try to capture this rocket in motion before it got out of our frame. And so in this particular image, I raised my ISO up around, I want to say around 3200 ISO, possibly 6400 ISO, which gave me a faster shutter speed. And although there is some graininess and texture here on the trees that you'll see if you really zoom in, for my purposes, that little bit of grain or grit was acceptable in order to be able to capture the shot of this rocket in motion. So I made the trade-off, chose a higher ISO, and got the image that I was looking for. So in our next video, we're going to take just a few minutes and take a look at the impact of aperture. What exactly is aperture and how does it affect our images? So go ahead and go back to the Moodle and click on the video for aperture.